In April 1241, on the Mohi plain, 60,000 Hungarian knights formed their battle line waiting for a death already decided. Their exquisite plate armor glittered under the medieval sun, becoming what they believed was the strongest defensive wall in Europe. In 1241, the most powerful army in Europe was convinced that a narrow stone bridge was enough to stop the Mongol Empire cold. They were wrong, because it wasn't cavalry that ended the legendary Age of Knights, but artillery, in just 6 hours of fighting. How could 7 crude machines break the most elite defensive system on Earth, shielded by a deep river and deadly terrain? King Béla IV of Hungary carried the mission of guarding Europe's gateway with heavy cavalry, the pride of all Christendom. He gathered nobles and Knights Templar to build a mobile fortress wagons chained together on the riverbank flats of the Sajó. Across the river, Subutai, the empire's master architect, watched in silence, searching for a single crack in the defense. Batu Khan commanded the expeditionary army with one goal: erase the Kingdom of Hungary and fling open the road straight toward Rome. This duel was not just a fight for territory, it was a battle that would decide the survival of an entire Christian civilization. Any mistake in strategic calculation would be paid for in the blood of tens of thousands and the collapse of a dynasty. A secret nighttime crossing plan, supported by improvised pontoon bridges, was already being prepared with ruthless precision by Mongol engineers. Naphtha fireballs were being loaded into stone throwers, ready to burst in midair and pour terror onto the Hungarian camp. A corridor of death trap was slowly closing, meant to turn the enemy's retreat into one of the bloodiest massacres of the Middle Ages. To understand this tragedy, we must rewind to the moment internal fractures began tearing the Kingdom of Hungary apart from within. The Kingdom of Hungary in the mid-13th century was a great power already cracking apart, as conflict between the king and the feudal nobility reached a breaking point. The arrival of Cuman refugees from the east became the final spark, pushing the nobles to turn their backs on Béla IV's throne. When Mongol envoys carrying impossible demands were executed, hostility between the two empires officially hardened into total war. By then, the Mongols had become a massive war machine, absorbing military engineering and siege artillery expertise from the Chinese world. The lightning rise of the steppe horsemen wasn't driven by muscle alone, but by an exceptionally sophisticated network of intelligence and reconnaissance. Hungary managed to assemble close to 80,000 men, the most elite armored knights, alongside seasoned crossbow units. Their strength lay in expensive plate armor that could resist most ordinary arrows used by steppe warriors. But Hungary's lethal weakness was fractured command. Nobles argued constantly, and coherence was rare. Slow decision-making inside the war council kept them reactive, always a step behind the battlefield's rapid shifts. Meanwhile, Subutai's force numbered only around 50,000, yet it carried iron discipline and artillery technology that felt ahead of its time. They brought master engineers capable of building siege engines and field artillery on site, even under harsh conditions. The Mongols' one vulnerability was a supply line stretched across thousands of miles, forcing them to end the campaign with a fast, annihilating battle. The contrast sharpened. On one side, Europe's heavy, static machine; on the other, the East's lethal mobility. In April 1241, King Béla IV chose to sever any last hope of reconciliation and concentrated his army on the Sajó River. He believed the river, swollen by meltwater and running hard, would be a natural barrier the steppe army could not cross. The Hungarians began building their camp on the Mohi plain, chaining thousands of wagons together to form a circular wall of steel. It was a passive defensive method, relying entirely on infantry endurance and the firepower of crossbowmen guarding the bridgehead. Every final diplomatic effort collapsed. Both sides now stood on opposite banks, ready for a confrontation without mercy. The Sajó rose higher, no longer just a landscape, but a life or death boundary that would decide a kingdom's fate. And when the first fires of the Mongol camp began to glow across the river, the countdown to military disaster truly began. To break a wall of steel, the steppe army would need a plan that went far beyond the ordinary rules of Western knighthood. King Béla IV chose to stake the entire fate of his kingdom on a static defense along the muddy floodplain of the Sajó River, a marshy, treacherous ground. Hungary's strategy was simple: turn the river into a natural moat, and the single stone bridge into a lethal choke point. Every heavy crossbow unit was packed tightly at the western bridgehead, ready to pour a storm of bolts into anyone who dared step onto the narrow stone span. The king believed that behind a fortified ring of chained wagons, Mongol cavalry would be unable to exploit its true advantage, speed and mobility. That overconfidence in steel armor and terrain led the Hungarian War Council to neglect reconnaissance of the upstream floodplains. Across the water, Subutai spent hours studying every bend of the river, searching for a flaw in the defensive geometry. The old Mongol commander saw the stone bridge for what it really was, a trap, and the key to victory was a pincer strike from downstream. The operation was split into two synchronized thrusts. Batu Khan would absorb the fire at the bridge, while Subutai delivered a flanking blow. It was a high-risk calculation, demanding precise coordination between field artillery and combat engineers crossing the river. Every Mongol movement was timed to make the Hungarians believe the enemy was stalled by the roaring floodwater. 7 counterweight trebuchets were broken down into small components and moved in secret through the dense forests on the far bank. Special wagons carrying gears, axles, and heavy tension ropes rolled forward silently under tight cavalry security. All materials for a pontoon bridge, pine rafts, and braided ropes packed with dry grass were stockpiled at a concealed point south of the Hungarian view. Mongol engineers began assembling modular pontoon sections in darkness, under absolute silence, to avoid detection. This was no longer a wild steppe host, it was a high-technical military organization capable of solving complex construction problems in the field. While the engineers worked, Batu Khan's combat units started shifting toward the stone bridge to generate false pressure. As each trebuchet was completed, it was calibrated with exact aim toward the Hungarian crossbow positions on the opposite bank. A closed-loop supply system for stone ammunition and naphtha firepots was set up to guarantee sustained rate of fire once the order came. The preparation revealed a mindset ahead of its time, prioritizing suppressive firepower over bloody frontal assaults. All 50,000 Mongol troops took their positions, waiting for each hour as the first light began to touch the river surface. On the night of April 10, the air over the Mohi plain thickened as Mongol war drums began pounding endlessly in the distance. Small probing attacks at the bridgehead kept the Hungarians at maximum tension and forced them to burn through large numbers of crossbow bolts in the dark. Béla IV still believed the enemy was desperately trying to force the stone bridge, so he kept feeding reserves into the hot spot. The tension climbed with every drumbeat, and Hungarian morale began to erode under exhaustion and dread. The psychological battle had begun. The Mongols used darkness and sound to mask the real work, the pontoon bridge taking shape to the south. Hungarian nobles still argued over who would lead the counterattack at sunrise, unaware that death was already close. Then flames flickered around, the trebuchets signaling the final preparations for a bombardment unlike anything medieval Europe had ever faced. Mongol archers dismounted, ready to support the first assault at 4 in the morning on April 11. The dry grind of wooden chains across the winding axle sounded in the dark, the start signal of a military catastrophe already programmed for Hungary. The decisive second arrived when Batu Khan raised his command, sword, and gave the order to fire 7 engines of death, beginning to rain down upon the Sajó bridgehead. At 2 in the morning on April 11, Batu Khan's corps launched its first direct assault on the stone bridge over the Sajó. The thunder of hooves on the narrow stone span was swallowed by a dense storm of crossbow bolts from Hungary's expert defensive units. Mongol cavalry was driven back again, and again unable to break through the wall of steel shields and the brutally accurate long-range fire. Bodies of men and horses began to pile up at the bridgehead, choking a passage that was already constricted, lit only by flickering torches. Batu Khan nearly died in the failed breakthrough and was forced to order a temporary withdrawal to preserve a force taking heavy losses. For a moment, the battle seemed to tilt decisively toward Hungary, and King Béla IV believed the stone bridge was a fortress that could not be broken. European knightly pride surged as they watched the feared steppe army recoil before a single choke point. But this was exactly when Subutai intervened, ordering his engineers to bring 7 counterweight trebuchets into position. 7 colossal machines fired in unison, unleashing a display of firepower so terrifying it had no precedent in medieval warfare. According to Mongol accounts, this marked one of the earliest uses of sustained clearing bombardment as a coordinated mechanism to seize a contested bridgehead. Massive stones tore through the air with crushing force, smashing into Hungary's strongest defensive emplacements. The concentrated targeting on a single point paralyzed the crossbow nests on the west bank of the Sajó, leaving them unable to organize any effective response. Dust clouds and shattered masonry exploded outward, turning the unbreakable nightly strongpoint into pure chaos. The Mongols did not fire. Stone alone, they loaded the engines with naphtha firepots, packed with flammable liquid mixtures that produced choking smoke. Each firepot impact detonated with a booming crack and bursts of eerie flames that could not be easily quenched by ordinary water. A thick black smoke screen rapidly blanketed the entire riverbank, completely stripping visibility from Hungarian archers and crossbowmen. Inside that haze, Hungarian defenders could no longer judge how many enemy troops were crossing the bridge, and discipline began to fracture. The Knights Templar, under the command of Master Rembald, tried to hold the bridge's center in a last desperate stand to block the assault waves. They became exposed targets for the Trebuchets because heavy armor made dodging slow, clumsy, and nearly impossible. Hungarian groups began pulling back from their fighting positions, choking on smoke and terrified by a weapon system far beyond anything they understood. The 7 machines' suppressive power opened a safe corridor, allowing Batu Khan's cavalry to retake the stone bridge within minutes. Hungary's entire forward line was swept away, leaving a deadly gap at the main gateway into the heart of the Mohi plain. The screams of burning knights mixed with the groaning rhythm of wooden engines as crews kept loading for another bombardment. The Sajó bridge was no longer a barrier, it had become an open channel, and Mongol forces poured across like a flood that could not be stopped. And while Hungary threw everything into surviving the firestorm at the bridge, a far greater danger was quietly taking shape downstream. At 6 in the morning, while fog still clung thick to the Sajó, 30,000 of Subutai's cavalry appeared like ghosts from the south. After crossing the secret pontoon bridge built during the night, the corps completed a perfectly executed flanking march into the Hungarian left. The sudden emergence of a massive force, where no one expected it, drove the entire Hungarian command into panic. King Béla IV realized he had made a fatal mistake, pouring all reserves toward the stone bridge, while leaving the downstream floodplains completely exposed. Hungary was now trapped between 2 jaws of death, Batu's firepower in front, and Subutai's elite corps guided by a true genius closing from behind. Hungarian heavy cavalry tried to pivot and counterattack, but the marshy ground softened by thawing ice erased their momentum. Hoofbeats from both directions created crushing psychological pressure, and even the firmest ranks began to show signs of collapse. Subutai did not rush for a final blow. Instead, he kept tightening the noose with repeated harassment volleys, forcing the enemy into a shrinking space. Hungarian units were pushed back toward the center of the plain toward the wagon Laager they had built to serve as a fortress. In total chaos, 60,000 men, alongside war horses and supply wagons, were compressed into an area far too small to deploy properly. Severe military congestion began as infantry and cavalry trampled over one another, desperate to force their way into the camp. The wagon Laager, once a solid defensive system, suddenly became a death trap, blocking every attempt to form a coherent line. Hungarian heavy cavalry needed open ground to build a charge, but now they were fixed targets inside a giant killing furnace. The Mongols began using long-range engines to throw firepots directly into the encirclement, into a space packed with food stores and other flammable supplies. Soldiers' screams mixed with the shrill cries of horses burning alive, turning the daylight battlefield into a living inferno. Every attempt by the nobles to organize a breakout failed, undone by inconsistent command and chaos that could no longer be controlled. Béla IV watched the kingdom's entire elite being crushed inside the very wagon fortress he had trusted absolutely. When the ring closed tight and enemy morale fully shattered, Subutai played one last psychological move, the false exit. The Mongols deliberately widened a gap to the west, creating the illusion of a route to survival for men who had reached desperation. At once, tens of thousands of Hungarians threw away weapons and armor and surged toward that opening, choosing flight over a final stand. But this became the bloodiest phase of the battle, because Mongol mobile archers were already positioned along both sides of the escape route. The retreat turned into a 30-mile slaughter. Hungarian troops hunted like prey across open ground. Heavily armored knights, once they broke formation, became helpless against the speed and accuracy of steppe archers. Hungarian dead lay scattered along the roads leading west, marking the total collapse of one of Europe's premier field armies. The Battle of Mohi ended not in a fair duel, but in a systematic destruction plan built on calculation. And Hungary's collapse was not only a military defeat, it left a bitter lesson about rigidity, complacency, and falling behind the logic of a new kind of war. As sunset fell over the Mohi plain, a blood-soaked chapter of the Kingdom of Hungary officially closed in tragedy. More than 40,000 soldiers, along with the kingdom's noble elite, were left forever on the floodplain of the Sajó, after a massacre carried out with ruthless system. King Béla IV escaped in humiliation, watching his army and his realm collapse in a single morning. The Mongol Empire now fully controlled the Hungarian plain, throwing open the door into Central Europe with almost no remaining obstacle. Mohi was not merely a battlefield victory, it became a classic lesson in the use of suppressive firepower as a decisive combat tool. The clearing bombardment, created by 7 trebuchets, proved that Europe's steel walls of knighthood were now fundamentally obsolete. The collision between counterweight trebuchets and plate armor marked a major turning point in the history of global military engineering. The expensive armor that once symbolized aristocratic power became a crushing handicap against firepots and technological force. A feudal army system built on individual prowess collapsed under the pressure of a professional force defined by organization and discipline. Subutai taught Europe a costly lesson about synchronizing river-crossing engineers with artillery firepower in a war of annihilation. The legacy of Mohi still matters today, reminding us that survival depends on updating technology and changing strategic thinking. Military history will remember the Sajó not for the number of cavalry present, but for the way cavalry was destroyed by technology. The Sajó still flows quietly now, but the traces of one of the 13th century's greatest military disasters remain etched into the soil. Behind the horrific casualty figures lies a hard truth, a technological gap so wide that Hungary failed to recognize it in time to adapt. The fall of one of Europe's strongest armies became a blunt warning to any defense system built on rigidity and backwardness. History rarely remembers how many horsemen fought it, remembers those who mastered and operated the technologies ahead of their age. The mysteries of how Subutai directed the 7 engines of death have been examined and reconstructed through the most reliable historical records available. Subscribe and stay with us as we explore more classic military case files in the analyses to come. Historical truth often lives in technical details and strategic calculations details we sometimes overlook in old pages. Thank you for following this forensic journey through the Battle of Mohi, and we'll see you again on the next passage through the hidden cracks of time and history.